Good evening and welcome back to World Talks, coming to you live from Warsaw. I'm Sally Jastrzębska. Depending on the perspective, EU leaders either took a cautious step forward or simply delayed the hard decisions. In any case, they did not back the proposed 140 billion euros loan for Ukraine that several countries had championed. Instead, they issued a general pledge to, quote, meet Ukraine's urgent financial needs over the next 2 years and postpone the debate on Russian assets until December. To discuss, I'm joined by James Batchik, Associate Director at the Atlantic Council's Europe Centre. Good evening, sir. Delighted to have you with us. Thank you for joining.
Thank you for having me.
So one of the most heated debates this past week was over using this 140 billion euros in frozen Russian assets as a loan for Ukraine, right? So last year, the EU began using profits generated from the frozen cash as collateral for loans to Ukraine, right? But the idea under discussion now would go further by targeting the assets themselves. So what is holding this back legally?
Well, thank you for having me. Right now, Belgium is holding this back. So for some context, like you said, there's around 200 billion US dollars of Russian assets frozen inside Europe, and the majority of them are held in Belgium by a clearing agency. And European leaders want to use that money to generate a loan for Ukraine that would only be paid back once the war is over and once Russia has paid reparations for its violence. However, the plan is not without controversy, and specifically Belgium, as it holds these assets physically, doesn't want to be on the hook for repaying the money should it come to it and fears its own legal liabilities. So that's why the Belgian Prime Minister at the European Council demanded these safeguards for a mutualization of the risk, that every member pays into the money if it comes to it, and that every country that has these Russian assets take this action with Belgium. And at the end of the day, the Belgian Prime Minister wasn't satisfied with the promises that it was given for now, and so played spoiler until we have reconvening of the Council in December. So some of the concerns raised by France and Luxembourg and others who have now moved to support the move were concerned with the negative effects that the world markets would have about the credibility to the euro. Should this move, which is extraordinary, I grant you, be taken, and eventually Europe has to be on the hook for repaying this money.
Right, so this is not a small obstacle. So are there other measures of, supporting Ukraine financially? Could the EU, for instance, take out a joint debt, for instance, to support Ukraine?
Sure, there are other avenues that the European Union could take, like you said, joint debt to support Ukraine. Simply, countries could also just give more bilaterally to Kyiv, both for budgetary support, for military support, humanitarian support, et cetera. However, that's a political problem. The reparation loan is politically feasible because it would be using the leveraging Russian frozen assets to support Ukraine. Otherwise, it's continued assets that the Europeans would need to pay taxpayer dollars for.
Right. On a more positive note, 19th package of sanctions was approved. It bans Russian LNG by 2027. Is this a turning point in Europe's energy decoupling, so to speak, or is it just another symbolic measure?
No, I think this is a significant step in the right direction for Europe's energy decoupling ambitions from Russia. I also believe it has the benefit of showing greater alignment with the United States and contribute to the further squeezing of Russia's economy. So if you look back a couple of years, the European Union has these ambitions to decouple from Russian energy that it was so reliant on, and it did make strides with its previous efforts to decouple from coal and oil imports. And by some accounts, the European Union has decreased its energy reliance by some 90%. But the ugly truth here is that Europe is still overwhelmingly reliant on Russian gas. In 2024, just last year, it bought a record amount of Russian LNG, valued at some 11 billion euros worth of Russian energy imports, going directly into the Kremlin's war coffers. So as Ursula von der Leyen said, tweeted in her remarks announcing the package's adoption, the Russian gas sector is at the heart of the Russian economy. So by decoupling, it does have an impact. And combined with the fact that by 2027, which is the end date for the phasing out of Russian LNG, global exports of liquefied natural gas are looking to jump significantly. So Europe should be able to replace the LNG it imported from Russia from other sources like the United States, which should only support and help the US-EU relationship.
You've already hinted at this, but perhaps we could take a step back and take a look at these sanctions packages as a whole. So how effective have they been collectively, and which measures have had the greatest impact?
So I think we should take a step back and say that we should not expect one sanctions package or all of them cumulatively to be these silver bullets, but they are having an effect. So let's stick with the energy component for now. Reports suggest from this year that Russia's oil and gas revenues are declining significantly. In the first half of 2025, the Moscow's federal revenues contracted by, we estimate, maybe 15+%. And when you take into consideration other U.S. moves this week to sanction energy providers like Rosneft and Lukoil, the global price cap on Russian oil, and more, this is having a cumulative effect on the Russian economy. We've already heard Vladimir Putin this week say he expects some losses. And like I said, we shouldn't expect this or any other one policy to be a silver bullet, but we're already seeing Russia's economy is significantly overburdened. And it's being kept afloat by massive fiscal stimulus, spending on defense running some 8% of GDP. But we're also seeing its productivity has stagnated. Its labor market is overstretched. The IMF is projecting Russian growth rates just at 0.6% this year. So these sanctions are working. Now, there is still a significant amount of work to do. Evasion is especially endemic, especially in the energy realm with this so-called shadow fleet. That will require significant efforts by allies putting these sanctions on Russia to have constant vigilance and cooperation with third countries to really end this sanctions evasion by Moscow.
Mm-hmm. Right. For the first time, the EU also sanctioned 2 Chinese refineries which process and sell Russian oil. And we have, of course, US imposing sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil, as you've mentioned. So can we be talking about a synchronized response of EU and the US? And how effective will these US sanctions be? Because from what I gathered, voices are divided, right? Some experts are impressed. Others are saying they're not sure if, in fact, they will be enacted.
So on the first point, on a coordinated response between the United States and Europe, we can certainly hope so. Sitting here in Washington, I think that is a level of ambition that is a little bit unrealistic right now, given the White House's proclivity to move unilaterally. The Secretary of Treasury, Scott Bessent, did call up President Ursula von der Leyen in advance of the news breaking, but we are not seeing significant coordination so far between Washington and Brussels, although we hope that that certainly would happen in the future if these sanctions are to be effective. And to say that President Donald Trump's actions and sanctions pushing the Europeans to do more in alignment with U.S. goals is having an effect. Now, in the response to how effective these sanctions are going to be, it seems that the White House is serious. We're seeing significant frustration, both from Secretary Bessent when he announced the sanctions and President Donald Trump saying, my conversations with Vladimir Putin just don't go anywhere. And so being forced to take this action because the White House is seeing that the Russians are not cooperating, are not serious about peace. And so until such time as Donald Trump believes that Vladimir Putin is serious about peace, I expect these sanctions to be enforced.
Better late than never. Now, at the London Coalition of the Willing meeting, right, allies discussed long-range weapons after the US decided not to supply Tomahawks, basically. So how significant is that gap in Ukraine's capabilities? So
the Tomahawks here are important. There is no doubt about it. Both with their range and frankly their lethality would be a significant capability that the Ukrainians currently do not have. However, like the other kits that's been debated in the past, from the Storm Shadows to ATACMS, Javelins, Taurus, what have you, none of these are silver bullets, so to speak. Couple that and remind ourselves with the ingenious efforts we've seen Kyiv do with its own indigenous ideas, its own indigenous capabilities, including the daring drone attacks on Russian infrastructure earlier this year, deep into the Russian economy with its industry-leading drones. So equally important to these ideas of tomahawks or long-range fires, as we saw in the conversations and taking place in London, are supplying Ukraine with sufficient air defense or drone and anti-drone capabilities. And that's why you saw, in addition to the tomahawks and long-range fires, the coalition partners put such an emphasis on those at the meeting. So they're important. Ukraine should have them, but there is a bigger picture to tell here.
Now, let's take a quick look at the composition of the coalition of the willing, right? Because apart from those leaders in London, 20 others joined in by video conference, and that included Japan's new prime minister. This was the first time a Japanese leader has taken part in one of those sessions. Is there any significance to this? In other words, is the coalition becoming more robust, perhaps?
Well, I think there is some significance in the fact that the new Japanese prime minister did join. I think it's indicative of a realization among leaders, realizing that there is no distinction between an Indo-Pacific theater and a European theater. You know, the threats that Russia poses to Ukraine go not just to Ukraine, not just to Europe, but all over the world. And Japan is recognizing that strategic reality. We say China is watching what happens in Ukraine for any actions that it might take in Taiwan. And of course, that is a significant strategic reality for Japan. So I do think it's important that countries like Japan are taking place, and the coalition is becoming more robust, because at the end of the day, when a coalition takes any action, unity and purpose, unity among all the members will be important to show a fresh seriousness to Vladimir Putin that this coalition is not a paper tiger. It is willing to put some skin in the game when there is a ceasefire, as the leaders discussed in London.
So the end of the year is approaching, and with only a few weeks left in Denmark's EU Council's presidency to push key decisions on Ukraine before Cyprus, a less pro-Ukrainian member, takes over. How much urgency is there to act now?
Well, I think going back to the beginning of the conversation, there is significant urgency. We saw the discussion on the reparations loan be pushed down into the next December meeting of the European Council, which will take place on December 18th. So, of course, that will be a priority issue to resolve between now and then, as a significant amount of work has to go in from the Commission, from the European Council, with Denmark currently has the presidency over, to resolving. At the same time, there are other key questions involving the multi-annual financial framework, the EU 7-year budget, which support for Ukraine and its financial support is being wrapped up into. So significant work will have to go into ensuring that Ukraine is situated for the long term, both with financial support, humanitarian support, and military support via the reparations loan.
And before we go, I just wanted to quickly ask you about Hungary, because the country's revised National Energy and Climate Plan, adopted recently, has rebranded its energy relationship with Russia, calling dependence on Moscow a risk. So are we seeing some signs of perhaps Hungary rethinking its stance?
You know, we'll have to see how real that is. It's good news if so. You know, Hungary, as a member of the European Union who agreed to the 19th round of sanctions package, is on the hook to decouple from Russian LNG by 2027. And it shows, I think, if you look optimistically, that Budapest recognizes and knows that its relationship with Moscow pales in comparison to its economic relationship that it has with Brussels as a recipient of significant aid. So there's no replacing one with the other. It needs to be a partner with Brussels, and optimistically, we might see that this is a step in that right direction.
James Batchik, Associate Director at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching World Talks. Please stay for more here on TV.